me to remind you that next week I'm supposed to be at my son's graduation, so I won't be here, and then we'll have another week we'll have class, and that's the last class, and then we'll start on the Gospel of John with the next semester. So not next week I won't be here, but the week after that, I think it's the 18th.
It'll be the 19th, actually.
19th.
So we have class or don't have class next week?
Next week,
The
no
12th.
class.
The
No
12th,
class on
no
the
class.
12th, and then on the 19th,
We have class, and that's the last class.
last one of it.
Yes, and we'll do a wrap-up. But in this one, we'll do priest. We're going to do a little priest stuff, but okay, Jason, where's Jason? He helped. He sent me in the beginning. Okay, and I'm sorry, I can't read this either. I made the part you can read, I did. The part that's hard to read, I didn't do. Maybe I need to go back and mess with it, but I tried to find. What I did is he sent me some stuff, and I went on the internet and found a beginning. I found the Jewish calendar, and I put together. What I did is I moved the stuff together. Okay, so you see, if you can read it at the top, I guess the best one to start with, let's start with, you can see the time let's look at All Saints' Day and Christ the King. So All Saints' Day is set in a sidereal calendar, right? Sidereal, it's the sun, solar base, the Julian-based calendar, at the end of October, so that's 1st of November. And then Christ the King, and the church ladies will tell me, that it's supposed to, look, if you look at the calendar thing, it's kind of a little wacky, but I was looking at the Lutheran, so, this stuff gets a little funny. But Christ the King is the Sunday that before Advent, and the beginning of Advent, that's the next thing that happens. So we have Advent, and we're in the Advent season right then. And if you notice the festival of dedication, that's Hanukkah. The festival of dedication, that's what it says right there in the lower part.
That's
It's
real.
festival of dedication. I know you can't barely read it. That's theirs. That's what I robbed, borrowed, right? Then if you go up, and you'll see that we have Christmas, and the Christmas is a set sidereal day. That's the 25th, and then the Christmas. That's Christmas to Epiphany, which starts at the baptism of Christ. It's 6th January. That's also a sidereal because it's a set solar day in the calendar, which then goes to Transfiguration. Now, Transfiguration and Ash Wednesday are based on the lunar calendar that sets Easter, because Lent is 40 days, or to be most precise, okay, you got to go look it up, and nobody knows this stuff hardly unless you're like a church person making a church calendar, right? Unless you're like that little guy. There's some monk that's in the Vatican, and he's figuring this stuff out, and there's some monk in the Lutheran hour that's working, I don't know, there's someplace working this out. But it's actually 6 weeks minus 2 days, and then you don't count the fast days or the festival days. I don't think in that. So it's 40 days. It's something like that. Anyway, you have to ask the monk dude. But Lent goes from Ash Wednesday to the Holy Week. It goes specifically to Maundy, Thursday, and I didn't mark that down there. I thought that was just extraneous detail. But Easter is supposed to be right on Passover. And so if you look at Passover, let's see if we can read that. Let's see, Passover, the something or other, and then it's all lunar. So Lent, Easter, and then Pentecost is set based on basically Pentecost. They're supposed to be a line, right?
But every so often, Passover is not in the same week as Easter.
Yes. Well, yes.
Because of how the Jewish ones move.
We tried to discuss that. I tried to explain that to you because okay, what do they do? We don't know. We need to get a church. We need to get a church expert. I have not spent like 5 years studying this. You probably need somebody who spent like a long time, or you need. If you try to look this up, this is really hard to find. Information is hard to find. How does a church designate the year? I'm sure there's a couple of books, or maybe I don't think there's any short articles on this. So someone may know. Somebody figures this out. But yes, the Orthodox Church does it differently than does the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church and we do it based on the Julian Sidereal calendar. So we're based in the solar-based calendar, but also attached to the lunar calendar. The Jewish people we're all supposed to do it based on the original Torah, right? And we looked at the Torah. And if you look at the Torah, it's supposed to be, let's see, I can't read it. I got it right here. It's supposed to be the 15th, right? And it's supposed to start the 14th of Nisan. So if you look at Nisan, that's where Passover is supposed to be. But remember, I already told you, one of the first things they changed was they moved the Passover to the Shabbat. So that's why it changes. The Sabbath changes because, or the time changes because it's lunar based. So since it's lunar based, it could be on any day of the day, any day of the week, right? But what they do is they move it to the next Shabbat, the next Sabbath. They move it to the next Sabbath so they can count it. And also remember, we already talked about this. In some cases in the diaspora, they allow 2 days because of the difficulty of determining the new moon. Now today, you can determine the new moon, but what do you think they do? By tradition, they use 2 days to determine the new moon, and so it's stuck. So now we're stuck. We got this thing that's stuck. So it could be any day, but it gets moved. And I told you, in Jesus' time, if you look, you'll find that it was supposed to be on the day when Jesus had his Last Supper, right? That's when the Essenes would have kept it. That's when the Essenes are the guys and gals, the guys who kept the Torah, and not the Pharisees who mess with the Torah. Now, if you also notice, the Sadducees, who were the priests, we'll talk about a little bit, were going along with everybody by that time, right? So, they've totally messed up our calendar. Everybody's got a messed up calendar. I wish we did it like perfectly aligned, because then everything would be copacetic, right? But nobody does it the same way, which is really interesting when you think about it. You know, God is not ambiguous, but I think God likes ambiguity. You know why? Right? If there was no ambiguity, if you didn't think exactly the right way, then are you going to heaven? Right? No, it's not the way it works. Look, the whole point is that I know there's a whole bunch of people in different denominations, especially Nicaeans, that are going to heaven. There may be some Arians going to heaven, but I kind of worry about the Arians because they don't believe in Christ as God, which is a serious deficiency according to the stuff. But if you're a Calvinist and you're, which I think is really totally anti-gospel, but that's okay. If you're a Calvinist, that's all right. Because I know that if you trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, remember, you're convinced the Lord Jesus Christ, you're going to heaven. And that's the only standard. So whether you're an amillennial, postmillennial, premillennial, or non-millennial, or whether you're a transubstantiationist or a non-transubstantiationist, or whatever, guess what? As long as you're convinced the Lord Jesus Christ, you're going to heaven. So I'm saying God loves a little ambiguity, because if there weren't ambiguity, we'd all be in hell. Just saying. So I think it's very interesting that we start with the Jewish calendar and then we end up with the Christian calendar, and the Jewish calendar is all messed up, and the Christian calendar is double messed up, right? Or actually triple messed up if you want to count it right. So, in any case, it's very interesting that look at how the seasons match. And I told you before, I would really like I've got this thing where what I'll do is, okay, for next class, I'll try to fix this so it's legible. So Tammy would have got mad at me for not being legible.
It's not bad. I mean,
I know, I
it's
know.
really good.
So I'll try to fix it.
Just make
I
it bigger.
worked for like 3 hours making the inside, and then I got all the things and I made it into BMPs and JPEGs and PMPs so I could see which one would be the best. And so I brought it into my computer and put it into the stuff, and the printer, I printed 3 different ways, and it still came out as slightly hard to read, ambiguous, right? But in any case,
Just have to fold up all of it.
maybe, well, the thing is, see,
Folded the little one?
the
Yeah,
little
it's
ones are the ones that came from the Jewish source, see? Now, the big bold ones, the Nissan and
Yeah.
Yar, the ones, and also you notice, oh, you can't see it, but under Nissan it's Adid. You can read that. Okay, maybe your eyes are better than mine, so that's a positive. And there's also another one that has a different name too, Tishri and Heshvan. Anyway, I also put in for you, you see the little tick marks on the other side? What I did is originally I drew full lines across because I thought it was very interesting how they match. You notice Purim, and we talked about this. Purim is really close to Ash Wednesday and would probably be, if we had been doing a lunar calendar right, I bet Ash Wednesday should be right on Purim because that matches, right? That would have been a cool match. It's close. If you also look, you see that Christ the King and All Saints Day, if you look just beside it, the Holy Week Easter is right across to October. So not exactly the match, but it's kind of a close match. But it's right across from, guess what? The trumpets, the first of the year. You see that? It almost exactly matches in Tishri. Let's see, that would be Tishri. What's on my thing here? Tishri. Rosh Hashanah. So the first day of the Jewish year is almost exactly across the calendar from the Passover. You see that? And it almost exactly across from Easter. Yes, sir?
You know, you're talking about the lunar and sidereal. A sidereal calendar means that when the Earth goes around its orbit, it comes back to the same Sagittarius star. So it just goes around and keeps lining up. It takes 365 days. For the moon to do 12 cycles, it takes 354 days.
Right.
The equinoxes are 20 minutes off the sidereal calendar because of, I don't know, maybe the Earth's wobble or something. So there's no way you can possibly line these things up year over year without having to do some corrections. And then just as if you're saying, well, they decided to move it 2 days so that it falls on the Sabbath, and then take a day here and 20 minutes there. And, I mean, this is impossible reconciliation.
Well, the biggest thing I want you to see, from both the calendar and from our study, well, there's lots of stuff that's really important in the Torah, I think. But probably the most important thing for us to realize is the ambiguity of time, the ambiguity of years, the ambiguity of dates, the ambiguity of all this stuff. And when you recognize that the Torah was written about 4,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, no calendars, no Apple Watches, no nuclear timekeeping devices, no watches, no water clocks. The only thing they had was a sundial. And they're figuring out dates to this degree. You should go, woo, because that is huge. And one of the things, and I'm not pushing on this is a big point, but when we read in the Torah, especially about times and dates, What do you think the ambiguity is on all of that? From years, I mean, I can tell a month, but what's a month? Right? Even the months are ambiguous. They're 29 to 31 days. In 28, we got February. Weeks are set, but you can't set weeks in a year. And you can't figure out years without some pretty complex figure, right? And we're talking about sidereal is based on a star. There's also a solar year, which is not based on a star. It's based on the movement of the Earth around the sun, which is also a different number of days. So you got solar, lunar, sidereal, and there's a few others if you go look on Wikipedia or some better source. So just saying. So the biggest problem we have is we have another problem. I've already mentioned that to you. I won't go into depth. Maybe we'll mention it in the next thing, but I'll just make a quick note of it. Does Hebrew have numbers? No. They use consonants for numbers, very similar to, well, similar but not quite similar to what the Romans do. Roman numerals, the things you hated. Try to add, subtract, multiply, divide in Roman numerals. You will fail because you really need to have base 10, and base 10 works pretty good until you get to powers, and then you better have your log scales. Just saying. So those who are not math aware, be math aware. Those who are math aware, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and everybody should be math aware. Where's our education system going, right? Anyway, these are really, it's really important for us as 20th, 21st century people to recognize the scientific and historical realities that we're working with, especially with ancient documents. And it won't get help much when we go to the Gospel of John. Because even though we're moving 2,000 years into the future, that's 2,000 years of technology, right? It's still more similar to the ancient world than it is to our world. So we take our cultural blinders off and we start to see cultures. Anyway, I think I'm achieving. I'm getting closer. Where's Jason? I appreciate Jason sending me he sent me a raw, and then I worked from that, and then I worked from other sources. But I need to improve the stuff that I borrowed.
It's a pretty fancy piece of work. Thank you for doing all that.
It's an interesting piece of work, isn't it?
So how'd they get the word out? I mean, did the priests, were they the ones who said we're going to have Passover on this day this year? And then, because the people had to travel, they needed to know when it was.
Well, you see, this is the thing.
They didn't have phones.
God in the Torah.
Send an email.
All right. Well, I give you a pre-taste. We're pre-taste, right? We're going there, but obviously God sent them to Egypt. There's no way they knew anything about years or anything before they went to Egypt. There was until Egypt. There's no hours. There's no anything, right? And there's no minutes and seconds yet in history. So there's only hours, and the Egyptians were the ones who invented the hour, the concept of the hours. There's no hours until Egypt. There are no years until Egypt. The Egyptians are the guys, you remember those pyramid things? What do you think those pyramids were for?
Decoration?
Burials,
Thanks.
Hey, no.
They were aligned with the stars, weren't they?
They were developed to look at the sidereal things, and they used the polar star, we believe. They aligned their stuff to the polar star. And so if you look at the pyramids and you take time back to the time of the pyramid, that's where the polar star was, and the alignment of the polar star, Stonehenge is equinox based. And equinox based is pretty good. The next step, though, when you move up the scale, remember I told you, you start with seasons. Seasons will give you the equinoxes. And although you forget it, the most important festivals in the Saxon calendar was the summer equinox, where you had the big bonfires, and the winter equinox, where you had the Yule. That's where it comes from. The summer bonfires and Yule. You always like bonfires. You wonder where they came from. That was to celebrate the goddess gods. And then the Yule was to celebrate, by the way, the winter gods, which is the same goddess.
Those were solstices.
Solstices.
Equinoxes are spring and fall.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The solstices, you go by solstice and equinox. Those are easy to figure from seasons, so seasonally. But then after you figured that out, once you built your Stonehenge, the next step is sidereal. You're looking at stars, and you're noting the stars are more precise in determining the exact year. And the Egyptians did that. That's what the Egyptians kind of gave to us. The Greeks got it, borrowed it. Everybody borrows from everybody else, right?
Cultural appropriation.
Cultural
It's a
appropriation.
good thing.
Cultural appropriation is probably the best thing, because otherwise we'd still be wearing bear skins and celebrating the seasonal solstices and equinoxes, right? Yeah, but instead we borrowed it, and guess what? We got Christianity, which is one of the best borrowers ever, because now we got law.
And gospel.
Well, law, at least law and Greek logic. Law and logic is what really developed Western civilization. Anyway,
And like in Jesus' day, how did the people of Nazareth know what day they should come to Jerusalem for these? Because they were required. How did they get the word out? They didn't write letters, did they? Maybe they did.
now, okay, this is a great
It's a
question.
change every year.
This is a wonderful and a great question. We believe that the rabbis, the Pharisees, would keep into communication with one another. Now, the Sadducees didn't care, except for one thing. If you didn't bring the sacrifices, they wouldn't eat. So we know that the Sadducees cared to the point that they needed the people at the feasts to do the things. And the feasts are set. There's 3 set feasts, and the other feasts are not. So the other ones, for example, in your first fruits or your fruits, right? When you bring them, you were supposed to bring them at a certain time, but they were the tithe. Your tithe could come at any time. And remember, you could turn a tithe to money, even in the early Old Testament era. In the Judges, we see in Samuel that his mother and father of Samuel turned their money into tithe, and then that was allowed. Then you brought it to Jerusalem and bought sacrifices, you bought food based on the tithe. So you could bring food or you could bring money at that time. Money, they had proto money. Wow, it's complicated, right? But so the Sadducees were interested in getting the word out so that people would bring sacrifices, or they started it, right?
So Lana, one of the books I remember, I forget which one it was. I don't know if it was Edersheim or the other one I was reading, but they said they had a signaling system that when the new moon, like because people that lived far away, or it was a cloudy day, whatever, but they blew a trumpet, or they had a signaling system that went from village to whatever. That yes, we have decided this is the new moon has been determined, and so that everybody was on the same day.
Yes, they did. I was going to get to that. The thing is that the rabbis, the Pharisees, were in their synagogues, right? In every village, supposedly everything with more than 10 men, right, in a community, they could have a synagogue. May or may not. They usually would try them. So every village, even a small village, would have a Pharisee, Pharisee had a rabbi in a synagogue, and might have had a Torah scroll. So it's in the best interest of the Sadducees to share this information. And by the way, by Jesus' time, Josephus tells us there was a water clock in the temple. And the water clock was counting, we don't think it counted hours yet. The Zoroastrians invented hours. It could have done hours or minutes. 60 minutes in an hour. It may have done it by Zoroastrian time, but it was at least hours. So they knew the time of the day, even when it was cloudy or dark, right? That's why in Jesus, when we look at the crucifixion of Christ, they knew what time it was, but they couldn't sacrifice because it was dark. There's a huge problem for them. So we know that the Sadducees kept great track of this. They kept track based on the Torah thing, right? So what do you think happened? The Sadducees wanted the information out, so they would send the information to the synagogues in Jerusalem, right? And the Pharisees, the rabbis, what do you think they did? They had a system. Now, it could have been just like you see in the Lord of the Rings, which
I was just thinking of the beacons.
the beacons, yeah, the beacons, the trumpets could be. The problem with the trumpets is you're only supposed to hear the trumpets. Now, they're big time in the chauffeurs, but the trumpets were a certain time, right? So maybe trumpets, but we don't know. We don't think it's written down. We do know they had a signaling system. The Romans used heliograph stuff. They were pretty tricky with things, but smoke signals and beacon signals have been around since even the Stone Age Indians in America used them, right? Smoke signals. So that is a old world kind of method. But yeah, the thing is we know they have some type of signaling system. We know this, the Sadducees, the priests, would tell the Pharisees, would tell the rabbis, and the rabbis would get the information. Now there's another way they could do it too, right?
Well, the Persians used runners.
Runners, yes. The Incas, the Persians,
What about the Greek guy? Marathon?
the Marathon dude. Yeah. Well, if you, okay, this tells us something. Now the Romans were smart, okay? The Romans attached horsemen, so they had Pony Express. They attached the horsemen, they had 2 decurions, so they had 2 groups of 20 horsemen that were scouts and messengers. But the Romans also used heliograph, they used shiny stuff, they also used beacons, they used other methods of signaling. They were the first signal corps guys, where the Greeks had not invented that yet. Now, the Greeks you would have thought had, because what did they use to start fires? You use the sun on the back of a bronze shield, a shield, to start the fire, right? That's what they used. And matter of fact, that's what they use with the Olympics today. So we're not sure why. Maybe the Greeks didn't, because the first time they did it, they blinded the guy. Oh, I can't see. But that using the heliotrope, using mirrors and stuff, that's what the signal corps used for a bazillion years until the invention of
Morse code.
well, the Morse code and telephone and telegraph. Yeah, heliotrope. The Morse code basically came from heliotrope, or because they used signaling flags, right? So these are like if back when we were kids, they should have had a class, right? When we were kids in high school or junior high school, all about signaling methods in the world, right? Through history. But we don't. Oh, man. So now we got to review it ourselves and figure it out. But yeah, so like I said, it's the best interest of the Pharisees or the Sadducees to get the word out. Otherwise, they starve. It's the best interest of the rabbis to get the word out because they want to get to the synagogues. And now, did it go, like, for example, there are a lot of Jewish people in the diaspora. So, did they use runners? Did they do the stuff? Were they figuring out themselves, like the lunar stuff themselves? Because that is the reason they gave 2 days, right, in the diaspora for figuring the new moon. So, obviously, they didn't have any way of signaling that information. So anyway, yeah, this stuff gets really complicated.
I think you mean heliograph. 'Cause
Heliograph.
Heliotrope is a plant.
Okay, heliotrope, but heliograph. Yeah, using the sun for signaling. Yeah.
Not plants.
Not plants. Heliotrope turns to the sun, right? Alien or whatever. Anyway, I wrote a couple of words down here. I've got some stuff. We can look a little bit at priest stuff. Like I said, the most important thing is kind of clearing out the calendar. We'll do a review of the really cool stuff we've kind of done to kind of do a quick thing on the last one. But on this one, Let's just look at some of the priest stuff. So Deuteronomy 18, and I gave you some priests. I don't know if you guys have previewed this. The priests who are Levites, this is 18:1, Deuteronomy 18:1. Indeed, the whole tribe of Levi are to have no allotment or inheritance with Israel. They shall live on the offerings made to the Lord by fire, for that is their inheritance. They shall have no inheritance among their brothers. The Lord is their inheritance, as he promised them. This is the share due the priests for the people who sacrifice a bull or a sheep, the shoulder, the jowls, and the inner parts. Remember, we looked at the sacrificial system and the sacrifices. I guess I should write that up on the board. Let's see. So we have the 5 sacrifices. We have the ascension sacrifice, we have the sin, we have the guilt, we have the priests, and then we have the thanksgiving. And in the Messianic era, the only one that's required is the thanksgiving sacrifice, which is what we do in the Eucharist. So, the ascension sacrifice, Holocaust sacrifice, completely burned. The sin and guilt sacrifice, there are certain pieces. We know that the hide would go to the priest. There's some pieces, parts that go to the priest, but it's no edible, not edible. The priest sacrifice is grain, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. And then the Thanksgiving sacrifice, everybody participates in, including the priests. So, like I said, there's huge incentive to bring the priests. Now, I want to point out in Malachi, that is the most misrepresented verse in the Old Testament, where it says, bring your goods or bring your Thanksgiving sacrifices into the holy place. You know what I'm talking about? And you hear it all the time during stewardship.
Bring your tithes into the storehouse.
Yeah, but that's not what it says in the Hebrew. It says, bring your Thanksgiving offerings to the holy place. Why? Because you ate them. You're not bringing stuff for the storage in the holy place. That was a different offering entirely. As a matter of fact, if you remember, I think it's Josiah, what was the period? The one who discovered that they were cheating, the priests were cheating, because they weren't using any of the offerings at all. Remember, you can either bring, the Torah allows you to turn your offerings, your Thanksgiving offerings, into money. There are other offerings that can be turned into money also. And who knows what they were doing in the later times, right? We don't know. Because let's say a priest's offering is supposed to be basically wafers, bread, flour, whatever. But that's hard to travel with, right? So if I bring proto money or money, so I offer that to the priest. Is that okay? Probably. The priests are making the rules, and what rule would you make if you were the priesthood, right? So we know that they were stealing because I think it's in Josiah's time they discovered it. So Josiah put in the trumpets, in the trumpets. Let's see. We believe we're not sure if they were trumpets like this or trumpets like this. Trumpets like this are the ones you see at Sam's, right? They want you to throw your pennies in, and they roll around the side. They come in the middle. We don't know if they were like that or like this. We think they may have been like this, but either way, the point of the trumpet was to keep people from putting their hand in to steal the money, because it went down to a box. And this is a widow's mite. So when Jesus heard them putting the money into the trumpets, basically that's what he heard. He heard the widow's mites going clunk, clunk, and he knew it wasn't gold or silver. He knew it was made of iron. Either the widow's mite was iron or it was made out of bronze. Well, not copper. That's way expensive. It could have been bronze. But there's a huge discussion. Why would it be hard to find out if they were mites made of iron? What happens to iron? It oxidizes, yeah. Where bronze is not quite as bad, but iron coins, we believe that lots of mites were made out of iron, but the problem is having them, because once they're exposed to the elements, they're done.
Mark
And
and Luke both say copper.
what's that?
Mark and Luke both say copper.
No, they say mites, and that's the Greek.
Well,
It's been
in the
retrans-
English translation.
In the English translation,
Which we don't accept.
it's been translated to basically pennies. And they may say copper pennies. If you look at your King James, it'll say a penny. But it's mite in the Greek. And the mites are, it's a lepton. And so in the Greek, it's a lepton. And so a lepton is also called a mite. We call the widow's mite. The mite is another term of a Saxon piece of money. But yeah, that's what they say. Like I said, some coins they call by name, some coins they don't. Usually the ones that are more common. But remember, are coins common? No. I mean, this is an important message. And there's no money right now. There's no money in this period. It's all proto money if there's money at all. There's no real money.
But didn't the Pharisees have the money with Caesar's face on it? Because Jesus said, bring me the denarius
That
or
was
whatever.
first century.
In Jesus' time, first century. I'm talking about the
You're
Torah
talking about,
period.
I thought we were still on.
I'm sorry, I don't
the
mean
day
to
of the
skip it
living.
back and forth. We shouldn't skip back and forth, but it's really fun to see how things affect in time. Yeah, 600 BC, the Lydians invented money. About 300 BC, it's not ubiquitous, but it exists in commerce. And then by the time of Christ, yes, people had seen money. What was interesting is somebody actually had a denarius to show. The poor people might get a silver denarius or even a copper or bronze. Usually it's bronze. Copper is hard to get. Copper is really difficult to get and difficult to keep clear. It's better to put bronze in because you put tin, it stands up a little better. And I've got some coins. I should probably bring them from the ancient times. It's kind of cool. Anyway, coins are a really interesting thing. You can see them. There's some really cool coins over at the Museum of Treasures. Yeah, they got some in time, which is really worth seeing. But remember, the average person, a man might have gotten a denarius, but what would you rather pay him in? Food and stuff. Yeah, food and
If
stuff.
you got a denarius, you had to go right out and spend it for food anyway.
Right. And plus, you can't get change.
Yeah. Change is
Matter of fact, I'm going to throw this out. Okay, I'll go even further in time. You remember King James time, or even before King James time. Guys read Robin Hood? Remember Robin Hood by Howard? Okay, you ever read that? I read that like 15 times when I was a kid. I love that book. But in it, they didn't have, they don't talk much about money, right? What did they give everybody? Food and clothing. The clothing. Remember, they always said, and I'll give you, two suits of Archer green, or two suits of whatever green, right? And you go, well, who wants, pantyhose and a little thingy, right? It's because the clothing was really worth a lot of money. And, most people, it would be interesting to see a picture, because most people had only one set of clothing, and the poor may not have had hardly anything. And we're talking about people naked, right? Because even clothing had great value in the ancient times. It was handmade stuff. So, getting paid in money wasn't as valuable as getting paid in goods. And so that really continued even until, like I think I've told you, until the 1800s. The 19th century really is when coins and stuff became ubiquitous. And America was the first culture that was a non-starvation culture. So, this is huge stuff. 4, you are to give them the first fruits of your grain, new wine and oil, and the first wool from the shearing of your sheep. For the Lord your God has chosen them and their descendants out of all your tribes to stand and minister in the Lord's name always. Now you notice, he didn't say the tithes, it said the first fruits. So the first fruits go to the priests, and if you remember, we talked about first fruits. There's also I know it's hard to read on the thing, but there is the celebration of first fruits. And that happens, I didn't put the seasons of the wheat, but that's during the wheat festival. Remember the barley festival, nobody wants barley to make beer out of it, but the wheat is really a big deal. If a Levite moves from one of your towns anywhere in Israel where he is living and comes in all earnestness to the place the Lord will choose, interesting, he may minister in the name of the Lord his God like all his fellow Levites who serve there in the presence of the Lord. He is to share equally in the benefits, even though he has received money from the sale of family possessions. So this is really interesting. Apparently the priests and the Levites were given the towns, and were in the towns in each of the areas. Now this gets really complicated, because remember Zechariah, right? Zechariah apparently lived, he would have had to have lived in a town, and then when he was posted, and he was of the priesthood, he wasn't just a normal Levite, right? To be part of the priesthood, you were a Levite first, but then you had to be a son or a descendant of Aaron to be a priest. And so in Zechariah's time, we could still tell, but apparently Zechariah, and so this already shows you what? Traditions have changed to this point, right? Because if you listen to this, it says, okay, if a Levite moves from one of your towns anywhere in Israel where he's living, and comes in all earnestness to the place the Lord will choose, which is Jerusalem, he may minister in the name of the Lord his God like all his fellow Levites who served there in the presence of the Lord. So by Zechariah's time, what had happened? Well, they were coming from outside of Jerusalem into Jerusalem, not moving, but on the lots. So apparently, this would indicate that what? They had a lot or few? In Jerusalem.
Well, I guess they didn't have as many because they had to bring them in from the countryside. But you know, that's what Edersheim was talking about, that they had, you know, but it seemed like there were a whole bunch of priests that were required each week. I mean, they were like, it wasn't 100, I forget, but it was a large, I was really surprised. And they were on a cycle, and they knew when they were supposed to go, but it's fascinating that it was that many, because they required so many at each of the different sacrifices and stuff.
I'm gonna draw you a little picture here. I should probably give you more information on this. This is really kind of important. So in the Torah, we have the Torah period. And in the Torah period, or how do you know a person is a Levite or part of the Aaron's family? Because they're there, right? Here's the Levites, and here's Aaron's family, and you go, okay, I know you. Hey, Tom, right? You're a Levite. I know that, right? You're not a Reubenite. You're not a, Benjaminite. You're a Levite, right? So this was cool because when they settled, so they settled in Jerusalem, and they had the other towns, or they settled in Israel, and they had their towns, and then they had a problem. Because remember, they broke into two, into Israel and Judah. And Jerusalem's over here. And guess what? The kings of Israel would not let the Levites go to Jerusalem. Well, there's a bigger problem. The Assyrians came in and did a big in-run. In their era, what they did is they just took the citizens. So they enslaved the citizens. And so this is the Assyrians. We don't hear much about them because they didn't come back.
Put a Y after that or something.
Okay.
I'm sure that's how they got it.
All right. Well, that's what Jonah called them. I'm just saying, Jonah called them, yeah. But then what happened to Judah?
Babylon happened, didn't it?
Babylon happened, and then the Persians later, and finally they let him go back. And when they went back, all of the males had been castrated, and so when all the females in the families and the males of the families came back, what did everybody want to be? Yeah, everybody wanted to be Cohen. Everybody wanted to be part of the priesthood, because the priesthood did what?
They got to eat.
They got to eat, and they got to eat off y'all. They didn't have to do the mining and the the working and the stuff like that. So everybody wanted to be a Cohen. So what do you think they did? They began putting together the genealogies. So the genealogies, they had the genealogies in numbers, right? But then guess what? We know they didn't do a whole lot of genealogical work, again, until after they came back from Babylon, from the Persian Empire. And that became very important to them. So in that, guess what? They found out you didn't have very many Cohen. Why didn't they have very many Cohen?
Because they were among the elite who were then castrated in captivity.
Bingo.
So there's no longer any hereditary line.
The loss of hereditary lines, and also, okay, like some of the Cohens, all right, what do you think the first generation Cohen families are like going into Babylon? Are they going to intermarry with the Persians? Nope. So guess what? You had a huge die-off in the families. Now, who knows if they're Cohens or not? I don't know. Only God knows. But they made a genealogy when they came back, and that genealogy is what determined the Cohens for that whole time. And remember, the Cohens were working in the temple. The problem is they didn't have enough. So the first thing they did was a lottery system, so they'd have enough Cohens working in the temple. We can see that in Ezra and Nehemiah. If you look deeply, you can see a lot of interesting stuff politically going on. But it's obviously by the time of Christ, they had set that up, because we see Zechariah coming from an outside village, coming into Jerusalem, working in Jerusalem as a Cohen, taking his time. As a matter of fact, a pretty high-end Cohen, because he's going into the holy place, right? Okay? And then the Cohen Hagdal, the chief priest, we see in the Christ period, when the Romans took over, what did they do? They said, baby, we're going to appoint our own Cohen Hagdal, because that's a very high political position. And we don't want you having that control over the people. So guess what? They changed them out every year. That's why Ananias and Caiaphas, and there were others. Every year they had a different high priest, because that way you dilute the priesthood and prevent their control of people. So
Did the Jewish people just agree to that? Do you think there was why would they let the Romans do that to them?
Because they asked him to come. Remember,
I know, but it just
back
seemed
in the
like
Maccabees, right?
It
That's
seemed
why
like
there were Essenes and Zealots.
seemed like there was
That's right.
The people who didn't want that
that
to happen.
happened.
Who
Okay.
didn't agree.
Well, the Essenes, remember, that this is so funny, because this is the stuff we should be learning, right, but we don't usually get. I'm happy to provide, and if you guys read it yourself from the apocryphal documents, from other documents, this is very important. So before, just before the Maccabean era, after 332 BC, after Alexander the Great had taken Jerusalem and taken, that area, and was part of the Seleucid Empire, because Alexander died, right? So in that time, the priests, according to the Maccabees, were becoming more and more Hellenized. And one of the Hellenized priests, believe it or not, because they believed the high priest had become pretty Hellenized, they decided to take their ball and leave, because the priests were becoming so Hellenized. And they created the Essenes. The Essenes were Sadducees. They were Levites, supposedly mostly Sadducees and Levites and priests, who left to keep to the Torah. They did not agree with what was happening in the priesthood, and they didn't agree with the Pharisees. The Pharisees were starting to come into power at that time. There weren't a lot of Cohens, but a lot of the people went with them out of Jerusalem. And guess what? Then they started illegally sacrificing in the high places in the name of God. Okay, so they've got a problem too. So the guys who are left, remember the Maccabees then took over. And the Maccabees kicked out the Seleucid Empire for a period of time, but they kept getting pressure from the Seleucid Empire, from the Greeks. They're Greeks. And also they're getting pressure from the Egyptians, who are also Greeks. And so, guess who they wrote?
Romans.
The Romans. They said the Romans were becoming up, and they were not a great power yet. It was the ones who were the greatest powers were the what? Thessalonians. It was Alexander the Great's heritage, but the Greeks were Thessalonians or Thessalonians. That was the Greeks. The Seleucids and the Egyptians were all Greek. And so the Maccabees asked the Romans in to help them with the Greeks. And the Romans said, do we want to get involved with the Levant? That is like, that's where almost all the stuff, almost every, all the trade goes through there. That's the trade for the Mediterranean. That's the trade from India. That's the trade from, what do you think they said?
Sure, yeah.
Oh yeah, heck yeah, that's the one. We want that place. Like, yeah, So they came in, and guess what? At first they were the buddies. They came and rescued them. They started taking over the thing, or they started helping. They helped kick the Greeks out. And by the way, they won I can't remember which the big battle was, but there was a huge battle they won against the Greeks, and the Greeks empires basically. The first one to fall was at the Greeks in Greece, which were the Thessalonians, and then the Seleucid Empire, kind of ish. They became the Perennians, and the Greek Empire fell to them too. That's Cleopatra. Remember Cleopatra and Mark Antony and all that stuff, right? And Caesar, all that stuff happening. Well, what do we got? They had the Maccabees. And there were 4 Maccabees. They said, hey, why don't we divide this country into 4 tetrarchs so it's easier for you to control it, Herod? And Herod's like, I don't know about this idea, but, when Herod the Great died, they divided up into 4 tetrarchs, which his sons managed. But very quickly, his sons were like despots and bad guys. So the Romans said, oh man, these guys are so bad. Guess what? We're going to send this one to Gaul. Herod the not great, was sent to Gaul. And this other one, he slipped on a knife, And then, each one of them actually, were either deposed or eradicated until Christ's time. And then you had Herod Antipas, right? Herod Antipas, who was the only one left who was in the one tetrarch. By that time, the Romans had put in Syria. They had the main head, who Pilate was a tetrarch, but he was basically head of a legion in charge of Jerusalem. And he had official stuff from the Congress, from the Senate. He had control of that area. But the priesthood, right, had been the Essenes, the Maccabees, and so how many Cohens were left? Who knows? And the Pharisees, right? So it's a huge problem. And by the way, the whole point of this is, what did Herod the Great do to all the list of descendants? He destroyed it because he was an Essene, and no Essene was, he was an Edomite, and no Edomite was supposed to be ever in the temple for every generation, Edomites, because remember if we read back in the Torah, where they fought Israel instead of helping Israel when they came across. And God cursed them in the Torah and said, all the other groups could, there were 3 generations and 10 generations, but the Edomites were no generation of Edomites. Isn't it ironic? The Greeks would have loved this, and the Romans too, although the Romans are not very good at irony. But the Greeks were great at irony. They probably laughed about it, because Herod the Great was an Edomite who came from being nothing to becoming the king of the Jews and the head of Jerusalem. And his 4 sons, although eventually deposed, were kings of the Tetrarchy. And then the Romans took over. And then, the rest is history, right? But the thing that's really important is that trail of descendants came from Babylon and Persia. It's still not clear if it was very correct to begin with. We need to do DNA checks, and of course they could do that, right? Yes, sure. And even today, because Herod destroyed the records, guess what? We have no idea about the lineage of anyone. But remember, they're very important and good thing, and we don't know when they started doing this, but the lineage for the Jews goes through the mother and not through the father. And you can see historically why that is very, very important.
Jesus' genealogy, though, they mention a few women, but otherwise it's all men in the list.
When we studied this before, the Matthew genealogy comes from the fathers, we believe, and the Luke genealogy is through Mary and through that genealogy, and we believe that the names themselves are settled in place, not for the fathers, but for the mothers. Because remember, in Jewish genealogy, it goes to the mother. And this becomes a very complicated, important thing, because basically, if the genealogy goes to the dads, well, it has to be wrong. Unless somebody snuck in there and, got away with, not being eunuch guys. Yeah. Or, you remember I told you, Samaritans were more Jew than the Jewish people coming back from Babylon. And that's really obvious. So.
We've only, let's see, 10:30, so I guess we can't really go on right now, but if all these genealogical problems happened and records were destroyed by the Babylonians and made right here and all this stuff, how do we have 2 good genealogies for Jesus going all the way back?
Because, and that's an easy question to answer, because at the time they still knew the genealogies from Herod, even though they were destroyed in the temple, the people remembered them and knew them.
But Herod was way after the Babylonian takeover of
Right.
and the exile and all that. And you said there was a lot of genealogical destruction then. So that was way before Jesus' time. So how did Jesus' genealogies make it?
They didn't keep track of it like on paper, but, it was, the best we know, it was, mouth to mouth or family, familial. It's like I said, how did you know in the Torah that it was a Levite? Well, they're over there. Look, the Levites over there. They got a big L on it, Oh, not on their forehead, on their tent. Anyway, thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us this week. In your name we pray. Amen.
Did you already say no class next week?
Yes.
And the 26th?
And the 26th, but I'll be back for the one between.
Yeah.